He walked into Riverside Sporting Goods asking about a rifle scope, nothing more. The kind of precision optic he'd once relied on when lives hung in the balance of a single shot. But the young clerk behind the counter took one look at his weathered face, his slow gait, his empty hands, and decided this old man wasn't worth his time. What that clerk didn't know was that the man standing before him had once been so dangerous, so effective, that 3 governments had agreed to erase every trace of his existence from official records. And exactly 1 hour after they laughed him out of that store, 12 Navy SEALs would walk through those same doors, not asking questions, but demanding answers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook, Tennessee, a town where everyone knew their neighbors and nothing much changed from one decade to the next. Riverside Sporting Goods sat wedged between Murphy's Tackle Shop and Henderson Auto Parts on Main Street, its brick facade weathered but proud. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over displays of hunting rifles, fishing gear, and camping equipment. The smell of gun oil and leather mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the pot that never seemed to empty. Danny Chen, 22 and fresh out of community college, leaned against the register scrolling through his phone. His co-worker Rick Martinez, pushing 40 but acting half his age, organized ammunition boxes with the enthusiasm of someone counting down minutes until lunch break. The store radio played classic rock at a volume just low enough to avoid complaints from the elderly customers who occasionally wandered in looking for birdseed or tent stakes. It was the kind of Tuesday morning that promised nothing interesting would happen. The hunting season hadn't started, the fishing wasn't prime, and most folks were either at work or thinking about it. The store's customer count for the day stood at exactly 3, all of whom had bought nothing more expensive than a pack of batteries. At 9:15, the front door chimed as it opened, and Michael Sullivan stepped inside. At 67, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its limits and learned to compensate. His jeans were clean but faded, his flannel shirt pressed but showing years of wear. A generic military surplus baseball cap sat low over steel-gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His right leg carried the slight hitch of an old injury, the kind that never fully heals but stops being something you mention. Sullivan didn't browse. He didn't examine the displays or run his fingers along the rifle barrels like most customers did. Instead, he walked directly to the counter with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what he wanted and didn't have time to waste. His calloused hands rested lightly on the glass case, and he waited with the patience of someone accustomed to being still for hours at a time. Danny glanced up from his phone with the practiced smile of retail indifference. "Help you find something today?" Sullivan nodded once, looking at that loopholed scope in the case there. The Mark V HD, wondering if I could get a closer look at the adjustments. The request was specific, technical, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what he was asking for. Danny followed his gaze to the high-end rifle scope displayed among other optics, its price tag reflecting the kind of precision that serious shooters demanded. "That's a pretty expensive piece," Danny said, making no move toward the display case. "You looking to actually purchase today, or just window shopping?" The question carried an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Sullivan's appearance, his age, his unhurried demeanor had apparently triggered some assumption about his financial situation or his seriousness as a customer. It was the kind of subtle dismissal that happened more often than people liked to admit, the automatic categorization of someone as unlikely to spend real money. "I'm familiar with the specifications," Sullivan replied evenly. "Used similar optics overseas. Just wanted to check the eye relief and see how the turrets feel." The mention of overseas service should have changed the tone, should have earned him at least basic respect. Instead, Rick Martinez looked up from his ammunition inventory with a smirk that suggested he'd heard similar claims before. "Overseas, huh?" Rick said, walking over to join the conversation. "Let me guess, Army, National Guard deployment to Germany. Kuwait maybe?" Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested the conversation was heading somewhere he'd rather not go. I'd just like to look at the scope if that's all right. Danny exchanged a glance with Rick, and both men seemed to reach the same conclusion simultaneously. This old man with his limp and his generic cap was probably another wannabe, another guy who'd spent a few months loading supply trucks and came home thinking he was Rambo. They'd seen plenty of them, guys who talked big about their service but couldn't tell a Remington from a Winchester. Thing is, Danny said, leaning back against the register, that scope runs about $3,000. Not really something we pull out for tire kickers, you understand. The dismissal was clear now, no longer disguised behind retail politeness. Sullivan stood quietly for a moment, his hands still resting on the counter, his gray eyes moving from Danny to Rick and back again. He seemed to be calculating something, weighing options, deciding how much this particular battle was worth fighting. I understand you think I can't afford it, Sullivan said finally. That's all right, happens more often than you might think. Rick stepped closer, emboldened by what he interpreted as weakness. Look, no offense, Pop, but we get guys in here all the time talking about their military service, wanting to handle equipment they've never actually used. That scope's for professional shooters, competition guys, serious hunters, not for someone looking to relive their glory days. The insult hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Sullivan absorbed it without flinching, without anger, without the indignation that most people would have shown. He simply nodded, as if he'd expected exactly this response. Glory days, he repeated softly, as though testing the phrase. That's one way to put it. Danny sensed victory, the satisfaction of successfully identifying and dispatching a time-waster. Yeah, well, maybe try the pawn shop down the road. They might have something more in your price range.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The suggestion was the final insult, delivered with the casual cruelty of youth convinced of its own superiority. Sullivan pushed back from the counter and straightened to his full height, which was considerable despite the years and the injuries. For just a moment, both young men caught a glimpse of what he might have been decades earlier, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. But the moment passed, and Sullivan simply said, "Thank you for your time." He turned and walked toward the door with the same measured pace he'd used coming in, neither hurrying nor hesitating. The chime sounded again as he stepped outside, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of his footsteps, and the lingering sense that something significant had just occurred. Danny and Rick returned to their phones and their inventory, satisfied with their handling of another tire kicker. They didn't notice the woman who'd been examining fishing tackle in the back corner of the store, a compact brunette in her 30s, wearing a University of Tennessee hoodie and jeans. Sarah Thompson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a military intelligence officer before returning to civilian life as a high school teacher. She'd heard every word of the exchange, had watched the old man's quiet dignity in the face of casual disrespect, and had recognized something in his bearing that the 2 clerks had completely missed. Sarah waited exactly 2 minutes after Sullivan's departure before setting down the tackle box she'd been pretending to examine. She walked to the front of the store, past the register where Danny and Rick continued their mundane tasks, and stepped outside into the Tennessee morning. Her hand found the phone in her pocket as she scanned the parking lot, spotting Sullivan's battered pickup truck pulling out onto Main Street. The number she dialed was one she hadn't used in 3 years, not since her discharge from active duty. It connected on the second ring, answered by a voice she recognized immediately despite the passage of time. "Rodriguez, Tank, it's Sarah Thompson. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to trust me without asking questions right now." Commander David Rodriguez, known as Tank to his team and selected friends, had learned to trust Sarah's judgment during their overlapping service in Afghanistan. Her intelligence assessments had kept more than one SEAL team alive during operations that never made the official reports. "What do you need, Sarah?" She looked back at the sporting goods store, then at the fading dust trail from Sullivan's departure. "There's an old man here in Millbrook. Just got thrown out of a store for asking to look at a rifle scope. Called him a wannabe, told him to try the pawn shop. But Tank, the way he carried himself, the way he talked about overseas service, the technical knowledge. This wasn't some weekend warrior. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, processing. You think he's one of ours? I think he's someone who matters, someone who earned better than he just got. Can you run a name for me? Michael Sullivan, probably late 60s, definitely has combat experience. Give me 10 minutes. The line went dead, and Sarah stood in the parking lot of Riverside Sporting Goods, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary Tuesday morning business. She had no idea that in exactly 8 minutes, Tank Rodriguez would be staring at a computer screen, showing a classified file so heavily redacted that only Michael Sullivan's name and date of birth remained visible. Everything else, every operation, every commendation, every record of service, had been blacked out under authority levels that Rodriguez had never seen before. But what would make Rodriguez pick up his phone and start making calls wasn't what the file showed. It was what it didn't show, and what that meant about the old man who'd just been humiliated for asking to look at a rifle scope he'd probably used to save American lives in places that didn't officially exist. Inside Riverside Sporting Goods, Danny Chen returned to his phone, completely unaware that he'd just dismissed a ghost. Rick Martinez continued organizing ammunition, oblivious to the fact that the man he'd mocked had once been considered so effective at killing America's enemies that 3 allied governments had agreed his very existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. Outside, Sarah Thompson waited for her phone to ring again, knowing that when it did, everything was about to change for the 2 clerks who thought they'd successfully handled a troublesome customer. Because in the Brotherhood of Special Operations, some debts never expire, and some men are never forgotten, no matter how thoroughly their records have been erased. The morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook, Tennessee, and the clock on the wall of Riverside Sporting Goods showed 9:23. In exactly 52 minutes, that same clock would witness an arrival that would transform a routine Tuesday morning into something the town would remember for decades to come. The Erased Sniper Parts 2-5. Sarah Thompson stood in the parking lot, her phone silent in her hand, as she watched the dust settle where Michael Sullivan's pickup had disappeared around the corner of Main Street. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of small-town Tennessee, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, the rhythmic hammering from Henderson's Auto Parts next door, the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the residential streets that branched off from the commercial district. None of it felt normal anymore. 3 years of civilian life had taught her to appreciate the ordinary moments, the peaceful Tuesday mornings when nothing happened and nobody died. But standing outside Riverside Sporting Goods, something cold had settled in her stomach, the same feeling she'd gotten in Kandahar when intelligence reports didn't add up, when the pieces of a puzzle were missing, and the missing pieces were the ones that got people killed. The phone buzzed in her hand, and Tank Rodriguez's voice was different when she answered. Harder, more focused. Sarah, where exactly are you right now? She gave him the address, the cross streets, a description of the strip mall where the sporting goods store sat wedged between its mundane neighbors. Rodriguez was quiet while she talked, and she could hear the sound of computer keys in the background, the muted conversations of other people in whatever secure facility he was calling from. The old man Sullivan, describe him again, everything you remember. Sarah closed her eyes and replayed the scene in the store, focusing on details she'd absorbed without consciously cataloging them. It was a skill the Army had taught her, the ability to observe and retain information that might prove crucial later. About 6'2", maybe 170-75. Gray hair under a generic military surplus cap, no unit markings, no insignia, moves with a pronounced limp in his right leg, but compensates well, doesn't favor it obviously. Hands are heavily calloused, old scars on the knuckles. Voice is quiet but carries authority. When he talked about overseas service, he mentioned specific technical details about the scope, knew the model designation without looking at the tag. What kind of technical details? Eye relief, turret adjustments. He asked about them like someone who'd actually used similar equipment operationally, not like someone who'd read about it in magazines. Rodriguez was quiet for almost 30 seconds, long enough that Sarah wondered if the connection had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard since their worst days in Afghanistan. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Michael Sullivan's file is classified at levels I've never seen before. Everything about his service record has been redacted under authorities that require congressional oversight to access. The only things visible are his name, date of birth, and the fact that he exists in the system at all." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She'd seen classified files before, had clearances that let her access operational details that could start wars if they leaked. But complete redaction, the kind Rodriguez was describing, was reserved for operations so sensitive that acknowledging them could compromise national security for decades. "What does that mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "It means Michael Sullivan was involved in things that officially never happened. Operations that were so compartmentalized that even the records of the records are classified. The kind of work where success is measured by the fact that nobody ever knows you were there." Sarah looked back at the sporting goods store, where Danny Chen and Rick Martinez continued their ordinary Tuesday morning, completely unaware that they'd just humiliated someone whose service record was buried deeper than state secrets. The irony was bitter and complete. The man they'd dismissed as a wannabe had been so effective at his job that 3 governments had agreed to pretend he'd never existed. "Tank," he asked to look at a $3,000 rifle scope, said he was familiar with similar optics from overseas. They called him a tire kicker, told him to try the pawn shop. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. When Rodriguez spoke again, his voice carried the kind of controlled anger that preceded very bad things happening to very deserving people. "Sarah, I want you to go home, right now. Don't go back in that store. Don't talk to anyone about this conversation. Don't post anything on social media. Can you do that for me?" "Tank, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to make some phone calls, and then I'm going to remind some people about the meaning of respect." The line went dead, and Sarah found herself alone in the parking lot with the growing certainty that she'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. She looked once more at the sporting goods store, at the hand-painted sign advertising hunting licenses and fishing permits, at the ordinary facade that concealed the site of an extraordinary injustice. 23 minutes later, as she pulled into her driveway 6 miles outside town, Sarah's phone began buzzing with text messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Each message contained the same 3 words, sent from different area codes across the country: "We're coming home." Back in Millbrook, the morning continued its lazy progression toward lunchtime. Inside Riverside Sporting Goods, Danny Chen had returned to scrolling through social media, occasionally showing Rick Martinez videos that made them both laugh. The encounter with the old man had already faded from their immediate attention, just another successful defense of their territory against someone who didn't belong. Rick was reorganizing the pistol ammunition when he noticed the first vehicle. A black Chevy Suburban with tinted windows, pulling into the parking space directly in front of the store's main window. The engine stayed running, and nobody got out. It sat there, silent and patient, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Probably another wannabe," Rick said, glancing at the SUV. "Bet he comes in asking about tactical gear." Danny looked up from his phone long enough to see the vehicle, then shrugged and returned to his screen. Neither of them noticed the second Suburban that pulled in 2 spaces away, or the third that parked across the street in front of Murphy's tackle shop. By the time the 4th vehicle arrived, a Ford F-350 with government plates, even the most oblivious observer would have recognized that something unusual was happening. But Danny and Rick weren't observing. They were lost in their phones, in their assumption that the world outside their store was no more interesting than the world inside it. They didn't see the men who stepped out of the vehicles, didn't notice the way they moved or the silent communication that passed between them. They missed the fact that 12 men had just arrived in Millbrook, Tennessee, with a single purpose that had nothing to do with shopping for hunting equipment. The men who gathered outside Riverside Sporting Goods didn't look like soldiers, at least not in the way Hollywood portrayed them. Some wore jeans and flannel shirts, Others dressed in khakis and polo shirts that could have belonged to insurance salesmen or real estate agents. Their hair was regulation length but not obviously military. Their vehicles were civilian models, well maintained but unremarkable. What marked them as different was invisible to casual observation but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. It was in the way they positioned themselves to cover all approaches to the building, in the casual efficiency with which they divided responsibility for the surrounding area, in the fact that despite arriving in separate vehicles, they moved with the synchronized precision of a unit that had operated together for years. Commander David Rodriguez stood slightly apart from the others, checking his phone one final time. At 42, he'd been leading SEAL teams for over a decade, had participated in operations across 3 continents that would never appear in any public accounting of American military actions. His team trusted him to make the hard decisions, to know when to fight and when to withdraw, to understand the difference between necessary violence and pointless brutality. This morning, the decision was easy. One of their own had been disrespected, dismissed, humiliated by people who had no idea what they were dealing with. It was the kind of situation that demanded a response, not for revenge but for principle. Because if Michael Sullivan could be treated like a nobody, then every veteran who'd sacrificed for his country was vulnerable to the same casual cruelty. Rodriguez looked at his watch. 10:13 a.m., exactly 58 minutes since Sarah's first call, 51 minutes since Sullivan had walked out of the store. The timing felt right, felt appropriate, not so immediate as to seem reactive, not so delayed as to lose impact. Just enough time for the clerks inside to settle back into their routine, to convince themselves that their handling of the situation had been correct. He nodded once to his team, and they began moving toward the entrance of Riverside Sporting Goods. Not rushing, not hesitating, just walking with the purposeful stride of men who had a job to do and intended to do it properly. The front door chime announced their arrival, a cheerful electronic note that seemed absurdly inadequate for the moment. Danny Chen looked up from his phone as the first man entered, then the second, then the third. By the time the 12th man had crossed the threshold, both clerks were standing upright, their casual confidence replaced by something approaching alarm. The store suddenly felt much smaller, the space between the counter and the door much more significant. The men spread out with practiced efficiency, not crowding but positioning themselves so that every angle was covered, every exit monitored. They didn't speak, didn't make demands, didn't even look particularly threatening. They simply existed in the space with the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier, made every sound seem louder, made the fluorescent lights seem harsh and unforgiving. Rodriguez stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. He was a big man, 6'4", and built like the linebacker he'd been in high school, but he carried himself with the controlled grace of someone who'd learned that true strength didn't need to advertise itself. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and when he looked at Danny Chen, the young man felt like he was being examined by something that saw much more than he wanted to reveal. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying easily through the store despite its conversational volume. "An hour ago, one of my brothers walked through that door. He asked to look at a piece of equipment he was qualified to use. You told him he couldn't afford it. You suggested he try the pawn shop. You called him a wannabe." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through every corner of the store. Danny felt his throat constrict, felt sweat beginning to form under his arms despite the air conditioning. Beside him, Rick had gone completely still, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Danny managed his voice higher than usual. "We get a lot of customers. Sometimes things don't go perfectly, but we try to treat everyone fairly." Rodriguez tilted his head slightly, as if considering this explanation. Behind him, the other 11 men remained motionless, their attention focused with laser intensity on the 2 clerks behind the counter. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, until Danny found himself wanting to say something, anything, just to break the tension. "The man who was here," Rodriguez continued,
Michael Sullivan. You thought he was just another old guy telling war stories, looking to handle equipment he'd never earned the right to touch. Is that an accurate assessment of your interaction with him? Rick cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. Look, we didn't mean any disrespect. It's just we get guys all the time who they talk big about their service but they don't really know what they're talking about. We have to protect our inventory. Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small and metallic, placing it carefully on the glass counter between himself and the two clerks. It was a military challenge coin, worn smooth by years of handling, its surface marked with symbols that neither Danny nor Rick recognized. This coin, Rodriguez said, was given to me by Michael Sullivan in 2003, after an operation in Iraq that you'll never read about in any newspaper. I was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, pinned down by sniper fire, 20 clicks from the nearest friendly position. Sullivan crawled through 300 meters of open ground, took out 4 enemy shooters with 4 shots, and carried me to extraction, single-handedly. He paused, letting the words settle. The rifle scope he wanted to look at today. It's the same model he used for that operation. The same model he used for 47 other confirmed kills, across 3 continents over a career that officially never existed. The man you dismissed as a wannabe has forgotten more about precision shooting than most people will ever learn. Danny felt his legs weaken, felt the floor seem to shift beneath him. The casual confidence he'd felt an hour earlier, the satisfaction of successfully handling a difficult customer, evaporated like water in the desert. He tried to speak, to offer some kind of apology or explanation, but his voice had abandoned him completely. Rodriguez reached into his other pocket and withdrew a photograph, placing it beside the challenge coin. It was black and white, clearly military, showing 8 men in desert camouflage uniforms standing beside what looked like a bombed-out building. The men were dirty, exhausted, but they were smiling. In the center of the group, unmistakably younger but clearly recognizable, stood Michael Sullivan. This picture was taken in Afghanistan in 2001, Rodriguez said. The operation was classified at the time, and remains classified today. What I can tell you is that the 8 men in this photograph prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of American civilians. Sullivan's shooting that day was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Rick stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to reconcile the confident, capable soldier in the image with the tired old man they'd mocked that morning. The disconnect was so complete, so devastating, that he felt physically sick. The man you treated like a nuisance, Rodriguez continued, spent 26 years of his life in places that don't appear on maps, doing things that can't be acknowledged, protecting people who will never know his name. When he retired, 3 different governments agreed to classify his entire service record to protect operations that are still ongoing. He's a ghost by necessity, invisible by design. Rodriguez picked up the photograph and the challenge coin, returning them to his pockets. He didn't come here for recognition. He didn't want to tell you who he was or what he'd done. He just wanted to look at a piece of equipment that reminded him of when his life had purpose, when his skills mattered, when he was part of something bigger than himself. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Danny and Rick stood frozen behind their counter, trapped between the weight of their mistake and the presence of 12 men who had come to deliver a message about the meaning of
respect. We're not here for apologies, Rodriguez said finally. We're not here for revenge. We're here because when one of us is disrespected, all of us feel it. When one of us is forgotten, all of us remember. That's what brotherhood means. That's what service means. That's what you failed to understand when you looked at Michael Sullivan and saw nothing worth your time. Rodriguez turned toward the door and the other 11 men began moving with him. Not hurrying, not dramatic, just completing their mission and preparing to leave. At the threshold, Rodriguez paused and looked back at the 2 clerks who remained frozen behind their counter. Michael Sullivan will probably never come back to this store, he said. Not because you hurt his feelings, but because he's too polite to make you uncomfortable. But every time you see an older veteran, every time someone with gray hair and old scars asks to look at something in your cases, remember this moment. Remember that you have no idea what that person has sacrificed for your freedom to stand behind that counter and treat them however you choose. The door chimed as they left, the cheerful electronic note somehow ominous now. Through the windows, Danny and Rick watched 12 men walk calmly to their vehicles, start their engines, and drive away as quietly as they had arrived. Within 2 minutes the parking lot looked exactly as it had before their arrival, as if nothing had happened at all. But everything had changed. The air in the store felt different, heavier with the weight of understanding. The rifle scopes in the display case seemed to carry new significance. The expensive precision instruments that represented life and death decisions made by men whose names would never be known. The casual arrogance that had filled the space an hour earlier had been replaced by something much more uncomfortable. The knowledge that they had failed a test they hadn't even known they were taking. Danny sank onto the stool behind the register, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just occurred. Rick stood motionless beside the ammunition display, staring at the spot where Rodriguez had placed the photograph of 8 soldiers in the desert. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that could undo what they had done or unsee what they had just witnessed. Outside, Millbrook continued its quiet Tuesday routine, unaware that 12 ghosts had just reminded 2 young men about the price of freedom and the meaning of sacrifice. The morning sun climbed toward its zenith, casting shorter shadows and warming the pavement where Michael Sullivan had walked away in dignity an hour earlier, never knowing that his brothers would come to reclaim the respect he had earned, but never demanded. The Erased Sniper, Part 6-9. The lunch rush at Maggie's diner was in full swing when Michael Sullivan pushed through the glass door, the familiar brass bell announcing his arrival to a room thick with the aroma of fried chicken and fresh coffee. Conversations buzzed around him as he made his way to his usual booth in the back corner, the one with a clear view of both entrances and no windows at his back. Old habits, he'd learned, were harder to break than old bones. Maggie herself, a woman in her 50s, who'd inherited the diner from her mother and intended to pass it to her daughter, appeared at his table with a steaming mug of black coffee before he'd even settled into the worn vinyl seat. She'd been serving him the same order for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved to Millbrook, and had long since stopped asking what he wanted. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, hash browns and coffee refills until he left. Simple, predictable, comfortable. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," she said, setting the mug down with practiced precision. "How's the day treating you?" Sullivan managed a small smile, the kind that reached his eyes but carried behind it. "Can't complain, Maggie. Beautiful morning for a walk." She nodded and headed back to the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the comfortable anonymity of being just another regular customer in a small-town diner. Around him, the Tuesday lunch crowd carried on their conversations about weather and work, local gossip and national politics, the endless cycle of concerns that filled ordinary lives in ordinary places. Sullivan lifted the coffee mug and inhaled the rich aroma, letting the warmth seep into his hands. His fingers, weathered and scarred from decades of hard use, wrapped around the ceramic with the careful precision he brought to everything he touched. The morning's encounter at Riverside Sporting Goods had already faded to the back of his mind, filed away with countless other small disappointments that came with being invisible in a world that had no use for old soldiers. He'd learned long ago not to take such things personally. The young clerks in the store had seen exactly what he'd intended them to see, an aging man with a limp and empty pockets, someone to be managed rather than served. It was better that way, safer for everyone involved. The alternative, letting people see who he really was, came with complications he'd spent the last 15 years trying to avoid. 3 tables over, a group of construction workers debated the merits of different truck manufacturers with the intensity of theologians arguing scripture. 2 booths behind them, a pair of retired teachers discussed their grandchildren's academic achievements. At the counter, a traveling salesman worked his way through a plate of Maggie's famous meatloaf while scrolling through emails on his tablet. Normal people living normal lives, protected by their ignorance of the things that happened in the dark corners of the world. Sullivan's eggs arrived with military punctuality, exactly 12 minutes after he'd sat down. Maggie's daughter Kelly, a 20-something nursing student who worked the lunch shift to pay for school, set the plate down with a smile that reminded him of someone he'd known long ago, someone whose face had been lost to time and classified operations. "Enjoy your meal, Mr. Sullivan," Kelly said, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Mom says to tell you the apple pie's fresh today if you're interested." He thanked her and turned his attention to his food, cutting the eggs with the methodical precision he brought to every task. The yolks ran golden across the plate, mixing with the hash browns in a way that triggered memories of field rations and mess halls, of shared meals in places where tomorrow was never guaranteed. He ate slowly, savoring not just the taste but the luxury of eating without watching the horizon for threats, without calculating exit routes or counting rounds of ammunition. The diner door chimed again, and Sullivan glanced up out of habit, his eyes automatically cataloging the new arrival before returning to his plate. A woman in her 30s, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a University of Tennessee hoodie. She looked familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. She took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee, and pulled out her phone like half the customers in the place. Sullivan was halfway through his hash browns when he noticed the change in atmosphere. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift that most people would miss but that set off alarm bells in anyone who'd survived by reading environments. Conversations were still happening, but they'd gotten quieter. People were glancing toward the windows more frequently. The construction workers had stopped debating truck brands and were looking at something outside. Through the front window, Sullivan could see the edge of a black vehicle, too large and too clean to belong to anyone who ate lunch at Maggie's diner. As he watched, a second vehicle moved into view, parking with the kind of precision that suggested military training. His stomach tightened, and he felt the familiar adrenaline surge that had kept him alive through 2.5 decades of operations that officially never happened. The woman at the counter turned to look at him, and recognition hit like a physical blow. He'd seen her before, not in Millbrook but in photographs, in intelligence briefings, in the kind of classified documents that outlined which friendly assets could be trusted in hostile territory. Military intelligence, if he remembered correctly. Afghanistan, probably 2019 or 2020, one of the last rotations before the withdrawal. Their eyes met across the diner, and she offered the kind of small nod that passed between people who recognized each other from the shadow world of classified operations. Not friendly, exactly, but acknowledgement of shared experience. Sullivan felt his chest constrict as the implications became clear. She'd been at the sporting goods store. She'd seen the encounter with the clerks. She'd made a phone call. The diner door chimed again, and this time everyone looked up. The man who entered was big, confident, moving with the controlled stride of someone accustomed to command. Behind him, Sullivan could see other figures, multiple vehicles, the kind of coordinated arrival that meant serious business. His hands, still holding his fork, began to shake slightly as 30 years of operational paranoia kicked into high gear. He was blown. After 15 years of careful anonymity, of building a life so ordinary that no one would look twice, his cover was compromised. The woman at the counter had recognized him, had made the connection between the old man asking about rifle scopes and the classified operators whose existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. In the space of a single morning, his carefully constructed invisibility had evaporated. Sullivan set down his fork and reached for his wallet, calculating the distance to the back exit, the time it would take to reach his truck, the probability of making it out of town before they decided he was too much of a security risk to leave loose. His retirement had always been conditional, always dependent on remaining invisible, remaining forgotten. The moment someone connected his current identity to his operational past, he became a liability that governments tended to resolve permanently. The big man scanned the diner with professional thoroughness, his eyes moving from table to table, until they found Sullivan in his back corner booth. For a moment that stretched like hours, the two men looked at each other across a room full of innocent civilians who had no idea they were witnessing a reunion that could determine whether an old soldier lived to see another sunset. Then the man smiled, and Sullivan felt something break loose in his chest, something he'd been holding tight for 15 years. Not fear, not relief, but recognition of a different kind. The smile belonged to David Rodriguez, tanked to his friends. A young Lieutenant Sullivan had pulled out of a firefight in Ramadi, when the world was younger, and the wars were different. Rodriguez moved through the diner with measured steps, nodding politely to the other customers but never taking his eyes off Sullivan. When he reached the back booth, he stopped and stood at a position that could have been casual to outside observers, but which Sullivan recognized as perfect tactical positioning. Close enough to provide protection, far enough to allow movement, angled to watch both entrances. "Mind if I sit down, Chief?" Rodriguez asked, using the title that Sullivan hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. Sullivan gestured to the empty seat across from him, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, trying to calculate whether this was a reunion or an execution. Rodriguez slid into the booth with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his career moving through hostile territory, and for several seconds the two men simply looked at each other across a table that held the remnants of a simple lunch. "You look good," Rodriguez said finally. "Retirement suits you." Sullivan managed a dry laugh. "Retirement's supposed to be permanent, Tank. You being here suggests it might not be." Rodriguez glanced around the diner, taking note of the other customers, the exit routes, the tactical situation. When he looked back at Sullivan, his expression was serious but not threatening. "What happened at the sporting goods store this morning wasn't your fault, Chief. But it was noticed, and when something involving you gets noticed, people above my pay grade start asking questions." Sullivan felt his stomach drop. He'd known this day would come eventually, had always understood that his freedom was contingent on remaining invisible. The classified nature of his service record meant he was both protected and imprisoned by secrecy. As long as no one knew who he was, he could live out his remaining years in peace. But the moment someone connected Michael Sullivan the retiree to Chief Petty Officer Sullivan the operator, his safety became negotiable. "How much trouble am I in?" Sullivan asked, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Rodriguez reached into his jacket, and Sullivan tensed instinctively. But instead of a weapon, the younger man withdrew a manila envelope, placing it carefully on the table between them. The envelope was unmarked, sealed, and bore the weight of official business. "That depends on how you define trouble," Rodriguez said. "The good news is that nobody wants to hurt you. The bad news is that your cover's been blown to enough people that maintaining your current lifestyle might not be sustainable." Sullivan stared at the envelope without touching it. "What's the alternative?" "That's what we need to discuss. But not here." Rodriguez stood up, his movement smooth and unhurried. "There are some people who want to talk to you, Chief. People who remember what you did, who understand what you sacrificed. This isn't an arrest or a termination, it's an offer." Sullivan looked around the diner, at the comfortable routine he'd built, at the ordinary life he'd constructed from the pieces of himself that had survived decades of extraordinary service. Maggie was refilling coffee for the construction workers. Kelly was taking orders from a family with 2 young children. The woman at the counter was still watching, but her expression was sympathetic rather than hostile. "What kind of offer?" Sullivan asked. Rodriguez smiled again, and this time it carried warmth instead of professional courtesy. "The kind that says maybe it's time to stop hiding who you are. Maybe it's time to let people know that heroes don't always look like heroes, that the men who keep us safe don't always get parades or recognition. Maybe it's time to remind the world that some debts can never be repaid, only honored." Sullivan picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside he knew were decisions that would determine the shape of his remaining years. Stay invisible and risk discovery, or step back into the light and accept whatever consequences came with acknowledgement. Neither choice was safe, but one offered the possibility of dignity. "The men outside," Sullivan said. "Your team, some of them. Others are people whose lives you saved, whose missions you made possible, whose brothers came home because of things you did in places that don't appear on any map. They wanted to be here when you made your decision." Sullivan looked out the window at the vehicles, at the figures he could see moving with professional precision, at the gathering of ghosts who had emerged from the shadows to offer him a choice he'd never expected to have. After 15 years of enforced invisibility,
The prospect of acknowledgement was both terrifying and intoxicating. He thought about the morning's encounter at the sporting goods store, about the casual dismissal from clerks who had no idea what they were looking at. He thought about the countless times he'd been overlooked, ignored, forgotten by a world that had no use for old soldiers whose service couldn't be acknowledged. He thought about the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared, stories that could never be told, recognition that could never be claimed. "What happens to my life here?" Sullivan asked. "To the routine, the anonymity, the peace." Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you choose, Chief. The envelope contains details about a program that's been in development for the last 5 years. A way to acknowledge the service of people like you without compromising ongoing operations. It's not perfect, but it's something." Sullivan broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. The letterhead was unfamiliar, but the signatures at the bottom belonged to names he recognized from the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. The document was brief, written in the careful language of official policy, but its meaning was clear. He was being offered a choice between continued invisibility and limited acknowledgement. He could remain Michael Sullivan the retiree, protected by classification but imprisoned by secrecy. Or he could become something new, a recognized veteran, whose service could be honored without being detailed, whose sacrifices could be acknowledged without being enumerated. "How many others?" Sullivan asked. 12 so far, including you. Men whose records are so classified that they've become invisible even to themselves. The program is small, carefully managed, designed to honor service without compromising security." Sullivan read the document again, noting the careful balance between recognition and protection, between honor and operational security. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than he'd ever expected to be offered. After decades of being officially non-existent, the prospect of being officially acknowledged was almost overwhelming. "I need time to think," Sullivan said finally. Rodriguez nodded. "Take all the time you need, Chief. But understand that the offer won't remain open indefinitely. The people involved in this program are taking significant risks to make it possible. If you decide you're not interested, there won't be another opportunity." Sullivan folded the document and slipped it back into the envelope. Around them the diner continued its normal rhythm, ordinary people living ordinary lives in blissful ignorance of the extraordinary decisions being made in their midst. He thought about Maggie and Kelly, about the routine that had given him peace, about the simple pleasure of being invisible, in a world that had forgotten how to see him. "The men outside," Sullivan said. "They're here because of this morning." Rodriguez shook his head. "They're here because of everything, Chief. This morning was just the trigger, but the respect, the loyalty, the brotherhood that's been building for 15 years. Every operation you made possible, every life you saved, every mission you completed, it all matters. It all counts." Sullivan stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his years and his choices. "I'll read this tonight. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." Rodriguez stood as well, extending his hand across the table. "That's all we can ask, Chief. Just remember, whatever you decide, you're not alone anymore. The days of being invisible are over, one way or another." They shook hands and Sullivan felt the calluses and scars that marked Rodriguez as a man who'd followed in his footsteps, who'd learned the hard lessons of service in the shadow world of classified operations. When they released their grip, Rodriguez turned and walked back through the diner, nodding politely to the other customers before disappearing through the front door. Sullivan sat back down and finished his coffee, watching through the window as the vehicles pulled away one by one, leaving behind only the echo of their presence and the weight of the decision he now faced. The envelope sat on the table beside his empty plate, containing the possibility of a future he'd never dared to imagine. Maggie appeared with the coffee pot, refilling his mug without comment. She'd seen enough in her 53 years to recognize when a customer needed space to think, when conversation would be unwelcome intrusion rather than friendly service. She left him alone with his thoughts and his choices, trusting him to work through whatever burden he was carrying. Outside, Millbrook returned to its normal Tuesday afternoon routine, unaware that one of its most invisible residents had just been offered the chance to become visible again, to step out of the shadows and claim a place in the light. The decision would change everything, not just for Michael Sullivan, but for everyone who had learned to overlook the quiet man who sat alone in the back booth of Maggie's diner, carrying secrets that could reshape their understanding of what service really meant. The afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, casting shorter shadows and warming the pavement where ghosts had gathered to honor one of their own. In a few hours, when the diner closed and the town settled into evening quiet, Sullivan would drive home to a small house on the edge of nowhere, carrying with him the weight of a choice that would determine whether he remained a ghost or finally became human again. The erased sniper final part. The small house on Maple Grove Road sat quiet in the gathering darkness, its windows glowing softly against the Tennessee evening. Michael Sullivan had built this routine carefully over 15 years, each element chosen for its invisibility, its ordinariness, its complete lack of distinction. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest ranch-style structure indistinguishable from dozens of others in the rural neighborhoods surrounding Millbrook. No flags, no military memorabilia visible from the street, nothing to suggest that its occupant had ever been anything more than another retiree, seeking peace in small-town anonymity. Inside, Sullivan sat at his kitchen table, with the manila envelope spread open before him, its contents arranged with the methodical precision he brought to everything he touched. The official document lay beside a handwritten letter from Rodriguez, both illuminated by the warm glow of an old brass lamp that had belonged to his father. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate provided a constant reminder of the world moving forward, without pause or consideration for the decisions being made in quiet rooms, by men whose names appeared on no monuments. The letter from Rodriguez was personal, written in the careful script of someone who understood the weight of words when they concerned matters of life and death. It detailed the program that had been offered, explained the careful balance between recognition and security, acknowledged the risks that came with stepping back into visibility after decades of enforced absence. More importantly, it conveyed the respect of men who had followed in Sullivan's footsteps, who had learned from his example, who remembered debts that could never be fully repaid. Sullivan read the letter twice, then set it aside and turned his attention to the official document. The language was bureaucratic, dense with the careful phrasing that characterized government communications dealing with sensitive matters. But beneath the formal terminology lay a simple proposition, the chance to be acknowledged for service that had shaped the course of history, while remaining invisible to those who benefited from it. He thought about the morning's encounter at Riverside Sporting Goods, about the casual dismissal from clerks who saw only an aging man with empty pockets and outdated clothes. The memory stung not because of the personal slight, but because of what it represented, a society that had forgotten the price of its freedom, that looked past the men who had paid that price in places too dangerous to acknowledge, in operations too sensitive to commemorate. The irony was complete and bitter. Michael Sullivan, whose shooting had prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands, whose expertise had guided operations that dismantled networks threatening American interests across 3 continents, whose silence had protected assets and operations that remained active 15 years after his retirement, had been judged unworthy of examining a rifle scope in a small-town sporting goods store. But the encounter had also triggered something unexpected, the emergence of brothers who had not forgotten, who had carried his legacy forward into a new generation of operators, who valued loyalty above convenience and honor above safety. The 12 men who had appeared at Riverside Sporting Goods represented more than personal vindication. They embodied the enduring bonds that connected those who had served in the shadow world of classified operations. Sullivan stood and walked to the window overlooking his backyard, where a modest garden struggled against the Tennessee clay, and a bird feeder attracted cardinals and blue jays, that provided the only color in an otherwise monochrome landscape. This view had comforted him for 15 years, had represented safety and anonymity, and the possibility of peace after decades of violence. Now it felt like a prison, beautiful but confining, protective but isolating. His reflection in the window showed a man who had aged well despite the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent in harm's way. The gray hair was earned. The lines around his eyes were maps of decisions made under pressure. The careful way he held himself reflected bones that had been broken and healed stronger. He looked like what he was, a survivor, someone who had outlasted enemies and allies alike, who had carried secrets longer than most people carried marriages. The decision he faced was more complex than simple acceptance or rejection. Stepping into visibility meant accepting responsibility for a legacy he had never sought, for recognition that came with obligations and expectations. Remaining invisible meant continuing to carry the weight of unacknowledged service, of stories that could never be told, of sacrifices that would never be understood by the people they had protected. Sullivan returned to the table and picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts he rarely used, names connected to a life he had officially left behind. Most of the numbers belonged to men who had served alongside him, who had shared the burden of operations that pushed the boundaries of legality and morality in service of national security. Some were dead, killed in action or claimed by the delayed effects of exposure to environments that human beings were never meant to survive. Others had disappeared into their own versions of retirement, seeking their own forms of invisibility. He found the number he was looking for and pressed call, listening to the electronic buzz, as the connection established itself across encrypted networks that routed through servers in countries that maintain careful neutrality in matters of intelligence. The phone rang twice before being answered by a voice he hadn't heard in 8 years. "Well, I'll be damned," said Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Webb, his accent still carrying traces of the Louisiana bayou despite decades of service that had taken him far from home. "Michael Sullivan, risen from the dead. I was wondering when someone would finally track you down." Sullivan felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd experienced in months. Webb had been his spotter for 7 years, the man who had calculated wind speed and distance while Sullivan made the shots that ended threats before they could materialize. Their partnership had been legendary within the small community of people cleared to know about it. A combination of technical expertise and intuitive understanding that had made them one of the most effective teams in the classified
History of American Special Operations. Marcus, good to hear your voice. I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a straight answer. When have I ever given you anything else? What's on your mind, Chief? Sullivan looked at the documents spread across his table, at the choice between continued invisibility and limited recognition. They're offering me a chance to come back into the light, not full disclosure, but acknowledgement. Recognition for service without compromising ongoing operations. What do you think? Webb was quiet for almost a minute, long enough that Sullivan wondered if the connection had been lost. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar decisions. "I think the question isn't whether you deserve recognition, Chief. The question is whether recognition deserves you. You've carried those secrets for 15 years, protected operations that are still running, kept your mouth shut when lesser men would have written books and given interviews. You've earned the right to choose how your story ends." Sullivan absorbed this, understanding the distinction Webb was making. Recognition wasn't something that could be granted or withheld by bureaucrats or politicians. It was something that existed independently, validated by the men who had witnessed his service, who had benefited from his expertise, who had survived because of his skills. "The program they're offering," Sullivan said, "it's not about money or medals or public acknowledgement. It's about letting people know that some of us existed, that the peace they enjoy came at a price, that there were men who paid that price willingly, and then disappeared into anonymity." "Sounds about right," Webb said. "Question is, are you ready to stop being invisible? Because once you take that step, there's no going back. People will know who you are, what you represent. Some will thank you, some will curse you, some will try to use you for their own purposes. You comfortable with that?" Sullivan thought about the morning's encounter, about the casual dismissal from young men who had no understanding of what their freedom had cost, who took for granted the security that had been purchased with blood and silence. He thought about the 12 SEALs who had appeared to defend his honor, who had risked their own careers to remind 2 clerks about the meaning of respect.
He thought about the weight of carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year, stories that deserved to be told even if they could never be fully revealed. I'm tired, Marcus. Tired of being nobody. Tired of pretending that 30 years of service never happened. Tired of watching people take for granted the things we bled to protect. Maybe it's time to remind them that freedom isn't free, that peace isn't natural, that somewhere in the shadows there are still men doing the hard things so they can sleep safely in their beds. Webb chuckled, a sound that carried both amusement and understanding. That sounds like the Michael Sullivan I remember, the man who never walked away from a hard decision, who never chose the easy path when the right path was available. If you're asking for my blessing, you've got it. If you're asking for my advice, I'd say it's about time you stopped hiding your light under a bushel. They talked for another 20 minutes, sharing memories of operations that officially never happened, of men who had died in service of objectives that could never be publicly acknowledged, of the strange fraternity that connected those who had served in the deepest shadows of American foreign policy. When the call ended, Sullivan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, clarity about his path forward. He sat back down at the kitchen table and reached for a pen, turning over the official document to write his response on the blank back page. The words came easily, flowing from convictions that had been building for 15 years of enforced silence. I accept the terms outlined in your proposal, he wrote, with the understanding that recognition comes with responsibility, that acknowledgement requires accountability, that stepping into the light means accepting the obligations that come with visibility. I'm ready to represent not just my own service, but the service of all the men who remain invisible, who continue to carry secrets that protect this nation, who deserve better than the casual indifference of those they have sworn to defend. He signed his name with the careful script he had learned in Catholic school 60 years earlier, the signature that had appeared on classified documents that shaped the course of history, that had authorized operations that prevented tragedies most people would never know had been threatened. Then he folded the document, sealed it in the envelope Rodriguez had provided, and set it aside for delivery the following morning. The decision made, Sullivan felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 15 years he had lived as a ghost, invisible and forgotten, carrying the burden of service that could never be acknowledged. Tomorrow he would begin the process of becoming human again, of stepping into a light that would illuminate not just his own service but the service of all the men who had followed in his footsteps. He walked to his bedroom and opened the closet, pushing aside the civilian clothes he had worn for 15 years to reveal a small metal box hidden behind rows of unremarkable shirts and pants. Inside the box, wrapped in cloth that had once been part of an American, lay the symbols of a career that officially never existed, challenge coins from units that appeared in no organizational charts, photographs of men whose names were classified at the highest levels, commendations for actions that could never be detailed in public records. Sullivan lifted out a single item, a worn leather journal bound with a simple string. Inside, written in his careful script, were the stories that had never been told, the operations that had shaped history while remaining invisible to those who benefited from them. Names of men who had died far from home in service of objectives they believed in despite never being able to explain them. Accounts of decisions made in seconds that saved lives measured in thousands. Records of a war fought in shadows by men who would never be thanked for their service because their service could never be acknowledged. Tomorrow he would begin the process of deciding which stories could be shared, which names could be spoken, which operations could be acknowledged without compromising ongoing security. It would be delicate work, requiring the same precision he had once brought to long-range shooting, the same careful judgment he had used to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent civilians. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Michael Sullivan allowed himself to remember who he had been before retirement forced him into invisibility. He read through his journal, reliving operations across 3 continents, honoring fallen friends whose sacrifices had never been publicly recognized, acknowledging the weight of decisions that had seemed impossible at the time, but which had proved correct in the harsh judgment of history. The phone rang at 11:30, interrupting his reminiscence. The caller ID showed Rodriguez's number, and Sullivan answered on the second ring.
Tank working late. Chief, I wanted to check in, see how you're processing everything. I know this is a big decision, a lot to consider. Sullivan looked at the envelope on his kitchen table, at the journal open before him, at the small collection of items that represented 30 years of service to a country that had never been able to thank him properly. Decisions made, Tank. I'm ready to stop being invisible. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice carried relief and satisfaction. That's good to hear, Chief. Really good. There are a lot of people who are going to be very happy to know that Michael Sullivan is coming back into the light. What happens next? We start slow, careful. There's a ceremony next month. Private, limited attendance. Families of some of the men whose lives you saved. Colleagues who remember your service. Officials who understand what you sacrificed. Nothing public. Nothing that compromises security, but recognition from the people who matter most. Sullivan felt his throat constrict slightly at the thought of being acknowledged by the families of men he had saved, of finally being able to accept thanks he had earned, but never been able to receive. And after that we see how it goes. Maybe some speaking engagements at military schools, some consultation work on programs that could benefit from your expertise. The goal isn't to make you famous, Chief. The goal is to make sure that people remember what service looks like, what sacrifice means, what it costs to keep this country safe. They discussed details for another 15 minutes, logistics and timelines, and the careful protocols that would govern Sullivan's emergence from the shadows. When the call ended, Sullivan returned to his journal, reading until the early hours of the morning about a life that had mattered more than he had ever been allowed to admit. At dawn he dressed carefully in clothes he hadn't worn for 15 years, pressed khaki pants, a white shirt, a blue blazer that still fit despite the passage of time. He looked in the mirror, and saw not the invisible retiree who had haunted Millbrook for 15 years, but the man who had earned his place among the brotherhood of warriors who had served in the deepest shadows of American power. The drive to town took 10 minutes. The same route he had traveled thousands of times as Michael Sullivan the nobody, but today he was traveling it as Chief Petty Officer Michael Sullivan, a man whose service had shaped history while remaining invisible to those who benefited from it. The difference was subtle but profound, carried in his posture, reflected in his eyes, evident in the way he held himself as he walked into the post office to mail his acceptance letter. The clerk behind the counter was the same young woman who had handled his mail for 15 years, who had never looked twice at the quiet man who occasionally sent or received packages with no return address. Today she glanced up and paused, noting something different in his bearing, something that suggested this was not quite the same person she had served routinely for so long. "Can I help you today, Mr. Sullivan?" He handed her the envelope, properly addressed and stamped, containing his decision to step back into the light, after 15 years of enforced darkness. "Just need this delivered, please." Certified mail. She processed the transaction with professional efficiency, but her eyes lingered on his face, searching for whatever had changed in the man she thought she knew. Sullivan thanked her and left, stepping into a Tuesday morning that felt different from every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. The drive home took him past Riverside Sporting Goods, where a small crowd had gathered outside the entrance. As he slowed to navigate around the parked cars, Sullivan could see that the crowd consisted mostly of older men, veterans by their bearing and their clothes, standing quietly outside the store that had dismissed one of their own. They weren't protesting or making demands, they were simply present, a silent reminder that respect was earned rather than granted. That service created bonds stronger than civilian indifference. One of the men looked up as Sullivan's truck passed, and their eyes met for a brief moment. The recognition was instant and mutual, two warriors acknowledging each other across the divide between the shadows and the light. The man nodded once, a gesture of respect that carried the weight of shared understanding, and Sullivan nodded back before continuing his journey home. The small house on Maple Grove Road looked the same as it had for 15 years, but Sullivan knew it would never feel the same again. He was no longer the invisible man who had sought refuge in anonymity. He was a warrior preparing to represent the service of all the men who remained in the shadows,
who continued to carry secrets that protected the nation, who deserved better than the casual indifference of those they had sworn to defend. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. Package received. Welcome back to the world, Chief. It's been waiting for you. Michael Sullivan, no longer the erased sniper, no longer the invisible veteran, no longer the forgotten warrior, sat on his front porch and watched the sun climb toward its zenith over a Tennessee landscape that looked exactly the same but felt completely different. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate process of sharing stories that had never been told, of honoring service that had never been acknowledged, of reminding a grateful nation that freedom came at a price paid by men whose names would never appear on monuments, but whose sacrifice had made those monuments possible. The brotherhood of warriors who served in the shadows had not forgotten one of their own, and now the world would remember too. Not everything, not the details that could compromise ongoing operations, but enough to understand that heroes didn't always look like heroes, that the men who kept America safe didn't always receive parades or recognition, and that some debts could only be honored, never repaid. In the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, and Michael Sullivan smiled for the first time in 15 years, knowing that his long exile from the light was finally over. 3 months after Michael Sullivan mailed his acceptance letter, the parking lot of Riverside Sporting Goods looked different. Not physically transformed, but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, an atmosphere that made people pause before entering, made them consider their words more carefully once inside. The same weathered brick facade faced Main Street, the same hand-painted sign advertised hunting licenses and fishing permits, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between the building and the street. Danny Chen arrived for his morning shift to find a small memorial growing beside the entrance. Not officially sanctioned, not organized by any group, just an organic collection of items left by people who had heard the story, and felt compelled to respond. Challenge coins from various military units, faded photographs of soldiers in desert camouflage, handwritten notes expressing gratitude for service they couldn't fully understand. A single American flag, folded with military precision, sat beneath a simple wooden cross bearing no name, no dates, just the words for those who serve in silence. The memorial had started appearing the day after Rodriguez and his team had visited the store, growing slowly as word spread through the veteran community, through social media, through the informal networks that connected people who understood the price of freedom. Danny had watched it develop with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, knowing that each new addition represented someone's attempt to honor the man he had dismissed, to acknowledge the service he had failed to recognize. Inside the store, the atmosphere had changed as dramatically as the scene outside. The casual arrogance that had once characterized interactions with older customers had been replaced by something approaching reverence. Danny and Rick had instituted an informal policy of offering military discounts without being asked, of taking extra time with veterans who wanted to examine equipment, of treating every gray-haired customer as potentially someone whose service deserved respect rather than suspicion. The change hadn't been mandated by management or imposed by corporate policy. It had emerged naturally from the understanding that they had failed a test they hadn't known they were taking, had dismissed someone whose sacrifice had earned him more consideration than they had been willing to provide. The knowledge that Michael Sullivan's service record was classified so deeply that even acknowledging his existence required congressional oversight, had fundamentally altered their perception of what retirement-age customers might represent. Jim Patterson, the store manager, had handled the aftermath with remarkable grace, neither blaming his employees nor attempting to capitalize on the attention the incident had generated. Instead, he had quietly instituted changes designed to ensure that such casual disrespect would never happen again. Staff training now included sessions on recognizing and honoring military service, regardless of how that service was presented. The expensive rifle scope that Sullivan had wanted to examine was now displayed prominently with a placard reading "Available for inspection by all customers, no purchase required." More significantly, Patterson had reached out to veteran organizations throughout Tennessee, offering the store as a venue for informal gatherings, equipment demonstrations and educational programs. The response had been overwhelming, with groups from as far away as Nashville and Memphis expressing interest in using the space for events that honored military service while educating civilians about the realities of modern warfare. The first such event had taken place on a Saturday morning in late October, drawing nearly 200 people to hear a panel discussion about the challenges facing retiring special operations personnel. The speakers had been carefully selected to represent different aspects of the transition from military to civilian life, but the subtext had been clear to everyone in attendance. There were heroes living among them, invisible and unacknowledged, carrying secrets that protected the nation while remaining unrecognized by the communities they had served. Sullivan himself had not attended the event, though his presence had been felt throughout the discussions. Speakers referenced a local veteran whose story we cannot tell in detail, and someone whose service reminds us that not all heroes wear their medals publicly. The audience had understood these oblique references, had recognized the careful language that honored classified service without compromising operational security. By November, the story had evolved into something larger than a single incident at a sporting goods store. Military publications had picked up the narrative, using it as an example of the disconnect between veteran experience and civilian understanding. The tale had been shared at military installations across the country, used in training programs designed to help transitioning service members navigate the challenges of civilian life, cited in policy discussions about how to better support veterans whose service could not be publicly acknowledged. The viral spread of the story had been organic and unstoppable, driven not by media manipulation or political agenda, but by genuine recognition of its significance. Veterans shared it with their families, trying to explain the weight of unacknowledged service. Civilians shared it with their friends, seeking to understand the hidden costs of national security. Young service members shared it with their colleagues, recognizing in Sullivan's experience a preview of their own potential futures. Sarah Thompson, the intelligence officer who had witnessed the original incident and made the call that changed everything, had watched the story's evolution with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Her intervention had been instinctive, driven by recognition of something that others had missed, but the consequences had grown far beyond what she had anticipated. What had started as a phone call to right a specific wrong had become a national conversation about how society treated its invisible protectors. She had kept in touch with Rodriguez throughout the subsequent months, following Sullivan's gradual emergence from the shadows with the professional interest of someone who understood the complexities of transitioning classified personnel to public acknowledgement. The program that had been offered to Sullivan was still in its experimental phases, limited to a small number of carefully selected individuals whose service could be honored without compromising ongoing operations. The challenges were immense and constantly evolving. How do you acknowledge extraordinary service without revealing the details that made it extraordinary? How do you honor sacrifice without compromising the security that sacrifice was intended to protect? How do you integrate invisible warriors back into a society that had never known they existed? Sullivan's case had become a template for addressing these questions, a careful balance between recognition and protection that honored his service while maintaining the classification levels that kept his operational details secure. The monthly ceremony Rodriguez had mentioned had grown into a quarterly gathering, bringing together families of men whose lives Sullivan had saved, colleagues who remembered his service, and officials who understood the broader implications of his career. These gatherings were necessarily small and carefully controlled, limited to people with appropriate clearances and legitimate reasons for attendance. But within those constraints, they provided something that had been missing from Sullivan's life for 15 years: acknowledgement from people who understood what his service had cost, recognition from those who had benefited from his sacrifice, Gratitude from families whose loved ones had come home because of decisions he had made in places that didn't appear on maps. The impact of these ceremonies extended far beyond Sullivan himself. Other participants in the program reported similar experiences of validation, of finally being able to share carefully edited versions of their stories, of no longer having to pretend that the most significant years of their lives had never happened. The psychological benefits were substantial and measurable, reflected in improved health outcomes, stronger family relationships, and greater engagement with their communities. By December, the program had expanded to include 23 individuals across 14 states, each representing a different aspect of classified service that could be honored without being detailed. The selection process was rigorous and slow, requiring extensive review of service records, careful assessment of operational security implications, and coordination between multiple government agencies that rarely shared information about their most sensitive personnel. Sullivan had emerged as something of an unofficial spokesman for the group, his natural dignity and careful way of speaking, making him an ideal representative for service that could only be acknowledged in general terms. His appearances at military schools and veteran events were carefully scripted and closely monitored, but they provided something invaluable, proof that extraordinary service was recognized at the highest levels, even when it could not be publicly detailed. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The invisible man who had haunted Millbrook for 15 years had been replaced by someone who carried himself with the quiet authority of acknowledged accomplishment. Sullivan still lived in the same modest house on Maple Grove Road, still maintained many of the same routines, but he no longer moved through the world, as if he were trying to avoid notice. The change was most evident in his interactions with other people. Where he had once been careful to remain unremarkable, he now engaged with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide his competence. Store clerks who had ignored him for years now treated him with evident respect, recognizing something in his bearing that suggested significant background, even if they couldn't identify its specific nature. The local impact had been profound and lasting. Millbrook had become a destination for military families, drawn by the story of the town that had learned to recognize the value of invisible service. The narrative had been embraced by local officials as evidence of their community's character, proof that small-town Tennessee values included respect for those who served without expectation of recognition. Veterans Affairs officials from across the Southeast had made pilgrimages to study what had happened in Millbrook, seeking to understand how a single incident had catalyzed such comprehensive change in civilian attitudes toward military service. The transformation had been organic rather than imposed, driven by genuine recognition of failure, rather than external pressure for reform. The broader implications were still being studied and debated. Military sociologists were examining the incident as a case study in civil-military relations, using it to understand the gap between veteran experience and civilian perception. Policy experts were analyzing the program that had grown from Sullivan's emergence as a potential model for acknowledging classified service without compromising operational security. But for Sullivan himself, the most significant changes were personal and immediate. He no longer carried the weight of being completely invisible, no longer bore alone the burden of service that could never be acknowledged. The stories he had carried in isolation for 15 years could now be shared in carefully edited versions with people who had clearance to hear them, whose own experiences provided context for understanding their significance. The loneliness that had characterized his retirement had been replaced by connection to a community of men who shared similar experiences, who understood the cost of service that could never be fully revealed. Monthly gatherings with other program participants provided opportunities to discuss the challenges of reintegration, to share carefully edited war stories, to acknowledge sacrifice that had remained invisible for decades. More importantly, Sullivan had found purpose again in representing not just his own service but the service of all the men who remained in the shadows, who continued to carry secrets that protected the nation, who deserved recognition even if they could never receive it. His speaking engagements at military installations provided opportunities to remind young service members that their sacrifice would be remembered even if it could never be publicly acknowledged, that the nation understood the cost of the protection they provided even when that cost could not be openly discussed. The original incident at Riverside Sporting Goods had become a touchstone for discussions about respect, recognition, and the hidden costs of national security. But for the people directly involved, it had become something more personal, a reminder that individual actions have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances, that casual dismissal of people whose backgrounds we don't understand can deprive us of opportunities to express gratitude we didn't know we owed. Danny Chen and Rick Martinez had both sought opportunities to meet Sullivan personally, to apologize for their treatment of him and to express their admiration for his service. Those meetings had taken place privately without fanfare or publicity, allowing both sides to acknowledge what had happened and move forward with mutual respect. The experience had been transformative for all involved, providing closure for an incident that had changed multiple lives in ways no one could have predicted. As winter settled over Tennessee, the memorial
outside Riverside Sporting Goods continued to grow, tended by people who understood that some debts could only be honored, never repaid. The items left by visitors had evolved beyond military memorabilia to include personal notes from families whose loved ones had served in classified roles, photographs of men and women whose contributions to national security could never be fully acknowledged, expressions of gratitude for sacrifice that could only be understood in general terms. Sullivan visited the memorial occasionally, not to claim recognition for himself but to honor the service it represented, to acknowledge the community of invisible warriors whose existence it commemorated. These visits were private and brief, marked by quiet reflection rather than ceremony, consistent with his understanding that true service was defined by duty rather than recognition. The story that had begun with casual disrespect at a sporting goods store had evolved into something much larger, a national conversation about the hidden costs of freedom, the invisible warriors who protected American interests in places that couldn't be acknowledged, the debt owed to men and women whose service could never be fully revealed. It had reminded a grateful nation that heroes don't always look like heroes, that the most important work is often done by people whose names will never appear on monuments, and that some sacrifices can only be honored through the gratitude of those who understand what has been given on their behalf. Michael Sullivan, no longer the erased sniper, no longer the invisible veteran, had found his way back to the light not through his own efforts but through the loyalty of brothers who had refused to let him remain forgotten. His emergence from the shadows had illuminated the service of countless others who remained hidden, whose existence was too dangerous to acknowledge but whose sacrifice was too important to ignore. The brotherhood of warriors who served in darkness had proven that loyalty transcended time, that recognition could be earned even when it couldn't be claimed, and that some men are remembered not despite their invisibility, but because of the service that necessitated it. In a world that often forgot the price of its freedom, they had created a space where that price could be acknowledged, where invisible service could be honored, and where the erased could finally be remembered. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves as Michael Sullivan walked the familiar path through Riverside Cemetery, his footsteps muffled by the carpet of gold and crimson that covered the winding gravel road between weathered headstones. This had been his routine for 15 years. The weekly pilgrimage to honor men whose names appeared on no public memorials, whose deaths had been classified along with their lives, whose sacrifice was known only to the handful of people cleared to remember them. Section J contained the graves of 3 men who had served with Sullivan in operations that officially never happened. Their headstones bore false names, fabricated birth and death dates, and epitaphs that revealed nothing about who they really were or what they had done for their country. To casual observers, they appeared to be ordinary citizens who had lived unremarkable lives, and died natural deaths. Only Sullivan knew that John Morrison was actually Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, killed by sniper fire in Somalia while providing cover for a hostage rescue operation. Only he remembered that David Fletcher was really Petty Officer First Class Anthony Brooks,
who had died from wounds sustained during a classified mission in Colombia that prevented a terrorist attack on American soil. The third grave belonged to someone whose real identity even Sullivan had never learned, a man known only as Phoenix who had operated at classification levels so deep that acknowledging his existence would have required presidential authorization. Phoenix had died in Sullivan's arms during a mission in Afghanistan that had prevented the acquisition of nuclear materials by a terrorist organization whose name could never be spoken in public. His last words had been a request that Sullivan remember him, not as Phoenix but as whoever he really was beneath the operational identity that had consumed his life. These weekly visits had sustained Sullivan through 15 years of enforced invisibility, providing connection to a brotherhood that transcended death, maintaining bonds forged in places where truth was the first casualty and loyalty was often the only thing that survived. The conversations he held with these silent companions had been his only opportunity to speak freely about experiences that could never be shared with anyone else, to process the weight of decisions that had shaped history while remaining invisible to those who benefited from them. Today felt different as he approached the three graves, carrying with him the knowledge that his own invisibility was ending, that the program he had joined would eventually allow some version of these men's stories to be told. Not their real names or the specific details of their operations, but acknowledgement that they had existed, that they had served, that their deaths had meaning beyond the fabricated lives commemorated on their headstones. Sullivan knelt beside Phoenix's grave and placed a small American flag beside the headstone, a ritual he had maintained for 8 years since the mission that had cost his unknown comrade his life. The flag was regulation size, properly folded, identical to the ones he left for Santos and Brooks each week. To anyone observing from a distance, he appeared to be another aging veteran paying respects to fallen friends, engaging in the kind of private ceremony that played out in cemeteries across America every day. But today's visit carried additional weight, informed by the knowledge that his emergence from the shadows represented more than personal recognition. The program he had joined was expanding carefully, adding new participants whose service could be acknowledged without compromising ongoing operations. Each addition required extensive vetting, careful coordination between agencies that rarely shared information, and delicate balance between honoring sacrifice and protecting security. The process had revealed the existence of hundreds of men and women whose service records had been similarly classified, whose contributions to national security existed only in files that required congressional oversight to access. Some had died in service, their deaths classified along with their lives. Others had disappeared into retirement so complete that even their families had no understanding of what they had actually done during their years of service. Sullivan's emergence had become a beacon for these invisible warriors, proof that classified service could be acknowledged even when it could never be detailed. His carefully managed appearances at military installations had drawn audiences of active duty personnel, who recognized in his story a preview of their own potential futures, who understood that the most important work they might do would never be publicly recognized. The impact had extended beyond the military community, to families of service members who struggled to understand the psychological costs of classified operations, who watched their loved ones carry burdens that could never be shared or explained. Sullivan's example had provided a framework for understanding how service could be honored even when it couldn't be discussed, how sacrifice could be acknowledged even when its specific nature remained secret. Standing in the cemetery among the graves of men whose real names had died with them, Sullivan felt the full weight of the responsibility he had accepted. He was no longer representing only his own service, but the service of everyone who had operated in the shadows, who had carried secrets that protected the nation while remaining unprotected by recognition. The stories he could now share in carefully edited versions were not just his stories but echoes of countless operations conducted by people whose names would never be known. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Sullivan completed his weekly conversations with his fallen comrades, sharing news of the program that was allowing their kind of service to be acknowledged, promising that their sacrifice would not be forgotten even if their identities remained classified. These one-sided conversations had sustained him through the loneliest years of his retirement, and now they provided closure for a chapter of invisibility that was finally ending.
Walking back toward the cemetery entrance, Sullivan noticed a figure standing beside the memorial wall, reading the names of local men who had died in acknowledged wars, whose service could be publicly commemorated, because it had never been classified. The figure was familiar, though it took him a moment to recognize Danny Chen, the young clerk from Riverside Sporting Goods who had dismissed him 6 months earlier. Danny looked up as Sullivan approached, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about consequences and responsibilities. The casual arrogance that had characterized his interactions with older customers had been replaced by something approaching humility, informed by understanding of how much he hadn't known about the people he had served. "Sullivan," Danny said, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the forced politeness of retail interaction. "I've been hoping to run into you. I wanted to apologize again for what happened that morning, and to thank you for what you've done since then." Sullivan nodded acknowledgement, recognizing in the young man's demeanor the kind of genuine remorse that indicated real learning rather than performative regret. The incident at the sporting goods store had been transformative for everyone involved, creating opportunities for growth that wouldn't have existed without the initial failure of recognition. "What have you learned?" Sullivan asked, the question carrying the tone of someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. Danny considered this carefully before responding, his words chosen with the precision of someone who had spent months thinking about the implications of his actions. "I learned that I had no idea what I was looking at when you walked into our store. I saw an old man with a limp and empty pockets, someone who probably couldn't afford what he was asking to see. I never considered that you might be someone whose service had earned him the right to examine any piece of equipment we carried." Sullivan appreciated the honesty, recognizing in it the foundation for genuine understanding rather than superficial apology. "And what will you do differently?" "I treat every veteran who comes into our store as if they might be someone whose story I'll never know, whose service I'll never fully understand, but whose sacrifice deserves my respect regardless of how they present themselves," Danny replied. "I've started asking questions instead of making assumptions, listening to answers instead of dismissing them, recognizing that the most important stories are often the ones that can never be told completely." This represented exactly the kind of transformation that Sullivan had hoped his emergence might inspire. Not dramatic gestures or public ceremonies, but fundamental changes in how people understood the relationship between civilian society and the invisible warriors who protected it. The program he had joined was designed to create precisely these kinds of shifts in perception, reminding people that heroes didn't always look like heroes, that the most important work was often done by people whose contributions could never be fully acknowledged. They talked for another 20 minutes, standing beside the memorial wall that honored local service members whose sacrifice could be publicly commemorated. Danny had questions about the broader implications of classified service, about how civilians could better support veterans whose experiences couldn't be shared, about the responsibilities that came with understanding the hidden costs of national security. Sullivan answered carefully, sharing insights that could be offered without compromising operational security, providing perspective that might help a young civilian understand the complexity of service that existed in shadows. The conversation represented the kind of bridge building that the program was designed to facilitate, creating connections between the visible and invisible aspects of national defense. As evening approached, they parted with mutual respect and understanding that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Danny returned to his car carrying knowledge that would inform his interactions with veterans for the rest of his life. Sullivan continued his walk home, reflecting on the transformation that had begun with casual disrespect and evolved into genuine recognition of service that could never be fully revealed. The small house on Maple Grove Road looked the same as it had for 15 years, but Sullivan no longer approached it as a refuge from visibility. The program he had joined had given him purpose beyond anonymity, responsibility that extended beyond his own comfort. He was now representing not just his own service but the service of everyone who remained in shadows, who continued to carry secrets that protected the nation while receiving no recognition for their sacrifice. His phone contained messages from other program participants, men whose experiences paralleled his own,
who understood the weight of transitioning from complete invisibility to limited acknowledgement. These connections had replaced the isolation that had characterized his retirement, providing community among people who shared similar burdens and similar understanding of what service in shadows required. The evening news carried a story about the memorial outside Riverside Sporting Goods, which had evolved into a permanent installation honoring invisible service members whose contributions couldn't be detailed, but whose sacrifice could be acknowledged. The reporter interviewed local officials who spoke about their community's commitment to recognizing all forms of service, visible and invisible, public and classified. Sullivan watched the report with satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with broader understanding. The program he represented was succeeding in its primary objective, creating awareness that extraordinary service often remained invisible, that the most important contributions to national security were made by people whose names would never appear on monuments. The story that had begun with his dismissal from a sporting goods store had evolved into something much larger, a national conversation about the hidden costs of freedom, the invisible warriors who protected American interests in places that couldn't be acknowledged, the debt owed to men and women whose service could never be fully revealed. As darkness settled over Tennessee, Sullivan sat on his front porch and read through letters from families of service members who had heard his story, and found in it explanation for experiences they had never understood. Spouses who had watched their partners carry burdens that could never be shared. Children who had grown up knowing their parents had served but never learning what that service had actually entailed. Parents who had lost sons and daughters to operations that could never be acknowledged. These letters represented the human cost of classified service, the families who shared the burden of invisibility, without understanding its nature or purpose. Sullivan's emergence had provided them with framework for understanding sacrifice that could never be detailed, service that could be honored even when it couldn't be discussed. The program he represented was still experimental, still limited, still careful in its expansion, but it had proven that classified service could be acknowledged without compromising operational security, that invisible warriors could be honored without being exposed, that some debts could be recognized even when they could never be fully repaid. Michael Sullivan, no longer the erased sniper, no longer the invisible veteran, had found his way back into the light through the loyalty of brothers who had refused to let him remain forgotten. His emergence had illuminated the service of countless others who remained hidden, whose existence was too dangerous to acknowledge but whose sacrifice was too important to ignore. The brotherhood of warriors who served in darkness had proven that some men are remembered, not despite their invisibility, but because of the service that necessitated it. In a world that often forgot the price of its freedom, they had created space where that price could be acknowledged, where invisible service could be honored, and where the erased could finally be remembered by those who understood what had been given on their behalf. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.